The room smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, and nobody looked up when Naomi Reeves walked in. That part matters. Remember it. She had taken the 6047 bus from Southeast, transferred once at Union Station, and walked 4 blocks in November rain because the taxi app said 32 minutes, and she didn't have 32 minutes. Cravat was a temporary one, the kind with the thick orange stripe across the bottom that tells everyone in the building you're a visitor or a contractor or someone who doesn't quite belong yet. It dangled from a lanyard she'd borrowed from the front desk woman, who hadn't smiled when she handed it over. The Hargrove Institute wasn't a household name unless you worked in aerospace defense. Then it was the name. 12 Nobel laureates had passed through its halls. 3 of the last 4 directors of DARPA had done their early research there. The building itself looked unimpressive from the outside. Gray concrete, narrow windows. But inside, the walls were lined with framed patents and photographs of men in suits shaking hands with senators. Naomi noticed exactly none of the photographs. She was looking for room 114. She found it at the end of a corridor that smelled like machine oil and dry erase markers. The door was open. Inside, a long seminar table ran the length of the room, and around it sat 11 people who all looked like they'd been there since before breakfast. Some of them were, on a whiteboard at the front, someone had drawn what appeared to be a trajectory model, curved lines, annotated in cramped handwriting, arrows pointing at calculations that filled every inch of available space. At the head of the table sat Dr. Warren Finch. If you spent any time in defense research circles, you know the name. If you haven't, here is what you need to understand. Warren Finch had spent 31 years building a reputation so large that it had started to cast shade on the people around him, without him even trying. He had a PhD from Caltech, a second from MIT, and a third that most people forgot about from the University of Edinburgh. He had testified before Congress 4 times. He had been on the cover of Defense Technology Quarterly in 2019 and framed the issue himself, which his colleagues knew because he had mentioned it. He was 63 years old, and he had never once in those 63 years been wrong in a room and admitted it out loud. When Naomi stepped through the door, he looked up the way you look up when a car alarm goes off somewhere in the distance, annoyed at the interruption but not especially interested in the cause. "This is a closed session," he said. "I know." She held up the orange-striped badge. "Director Paulson set me down. I'm the new hire from the Mobility Systems Division." There was a pause. One of the men near the middle of the table, older, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, glanced at Finch, then back at Naomi, then down at his notepad. "The new hire," Finch repeated. "Not a question, a reclassification." Naomi Reeves. She said her own name the way soldiers say their serial number. Clean, no decoration. Finch looked at her for a moment. The way someone looks at a word they don't recognize in a sentence they thought they understood. She was wearing a gray blazer over a black shirt. Her hair was natural, pulled back. She was 28 years old, and she had spent 3 of those years doing vehicle systems analysis for the Army before a contractor pulled her out and put her in a succession of roles that had led, through a path that was not straight, to this building, this hallway, this room. "Sit at the back," Finch said, and turned back to the whiteboard. She sat at the back. For the next 40 minutes, Finch walked the room through what he called the Ellison corridor problem. It wasn't new. Anyone who'd worked in autonomous ground vehicle navigation had bumped into some version of it before, but the specific iteration they were dealing with was stubborn. An autonomous vehicle operating in GPS-denied environments needed to be able to reroute in real time when its primary sensor array was disrupted, but the disruption itself introduced latency into the secondary system, and that latency, under specific angular conditions, produced a compounding error that the team had not been able to resolve. Finch had been working on it for 7 months. He said this with the particular weight of a man who expected the number to impress the room. 7 months. 3 senior engineers. A postdoc from Stanford. 2 consultants brought in from the private sector who had both since returned to the private sector without solving it. "We've ruled out the feedback compensation approach," he said, tapping the whiteboard. "The window is too narrow. We've tried adjusted weighting in the dead reckoning sequence. We've explored SLAM variant architectures, and the problem persists. He set the marker down, which is why the director thought it would be useful. He paused just long enough to let the word useful land the way he intended it, with a faint aftertaste of doubt, to bring in fresh eyes from mobility systems. He said fresh eyes the way some people say, bless your heart. Naomi was looking at the whiteboard. She had been looking at it since she sat down. Not the way you look at something because you're expected to look at it. The way you look at something when you've seen a version of it before and you're running the comparison in real time, quietly, without announcing it to anyone. One of the engineers near the front, younger, maybe 35, with the look of a man who'd been awake since 4 a.m, glanced back at her once. He'd seen that look before. He wasn't sure where. Finch picked the marker back up. Now, let me walk through why the angular threshold creates It's the reference frame. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet that falls when someone makes a comment in a seminar. The other kind. The kind where everyone is very still because they're not sure what just happened. Finch turned from the whiteboard slowly, the way a ship turns. I'm sorry. Naomi wasn't looking at him. She was still looking at the whiteboard. The secondary system isn't failing because of latency. It's failing because the fallback is still referencing the primary frame. When the primary gets disrupted, the fallback inherits a corrupted origin point. You're not fighting a timing problem. You're fighting a coordinate contamination problem. The room was very quiet. The man with the reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, took them down and put them on and looked at the whiteboard. Finch set the marker down again, this time more carefully. The reference frame assumption was tested in the 3rd week. The reference frame as a static problem was tested, Naomi said. But it's not static. The contamination is event-triggered. It only occurs when the disruption happens during a specific angular transition window, which is why it looked like a timing issue. But the timing isn't causing the error. The timing is just when the contamination becomes visible. Silence. Then the man with the reading glasses said very quietly, "Oh." His name was Dr. Curtis Obie. He'd been at the Institute for 19 years. He said it the way people say, "Oh," when a thing that has been sitting just outside their vision suddenly steps into the light. Not "oh, interesting," just "oh," the single syllable of recognition. Finch was looking at the whiteboard with an expression that was doing several things at once. That would require the contamination to persist across the handoff. It does. It's baked into the initialization sequence. Every time the fallback system spins up, it pulls the last known frame as its starting point. If the last known frame is corrupted, because the disruption happened mid-transition, the fallback starts wrong and stays wrong. She finally looked at him. The fix isn't in the dead reckoning logic. The fix is a frame flush protocol at the point of handoff. Clean initialize, every time, regardless of what the primary last reported. Another silence. Different texture than the first one. Finch said that would introduce its own latency. About 11 milliseconds. She nodded. Which is within operational tolerance for the intended use case. The compounding error you're currently generating is orders of magnitude larger. The engineer who'd glanced back at her earlier, his name was Theo Park, and he'd been staring at the Ellison corridor problem for 4 of the 7 months, exhaled through his nose in a way that wasn't quite a laugh. He pulled his legal pad toward him and started writing. Finch was still looking at the whiteboard. He was not the kind of man who said, "You're right," quickly. He was not the kind of man who said it easily. He had built an entire professional architecture around never needing to say it, because he had structured his career such that by the time a decision was made in public, he had already privately confirmed it. "We would need to verify," he said. "Yes," Naomi agreed. "You would." She didn't say it with an edge. She said it the same way she'd said everything else in the last 4 minutes. Level. Dry. With the particular economy of someone who has spent time in environments where words had better mean exactly what they say and nothing else. She had learned to talk that way in Fort Bragg, where she'd been the only woman in a 3-person technical analysis cell, and nobody had wanted to hear her talk at all until a vehicle system she'd flagged failed exactly the way she said it would, and then suddenly they'd wanted to hear everything. Finch picked the marker up again. He turned to the whiteboard, and for a long moment he didn't say anything. He was following the logic. You could see it in the way his eyes moved. Back to the trajectory model, to the disruption point, to the handoff sequence annotated in cramped blue ink. He put the cap back on the marker without writing anything. "Curtis," he said, "can you run the initialization sequence and flag where the frame pull happens?" "Already pulling it up," said Dr. Obi, and he was. The younger engineer across the table, a woman named Priya who'd come over from Johns Hopkins 2 years ago and had the sharp, watchful quality of someone who was always calculating 2 steps ahead, was looking at Naomi with an expression that wasn't quite a smile. It was the expression of someone who just watched something confirm a theory they'd had for a long time about how rooms like this worked and who got to speak in them and when. Nobody was looking at the whiteboard anymore. They were looking at the screen where Dr. Obi was pulling up the initialization sequence, and when the code came up and he scrolled to the handoff block and they saw there, right there, in 43 lines of logic, the frame pull happening exactly where Naomi had said it was, there was a kind of collective exhale in the room. Theo Park actually laughed, a short, slightly disbelieving sound. He wrote something on his legal pad and underlined it twice. Finch was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How long have you been in mobility systems?" "At the Institute? This is my first day." That landed the way she knew it would. She wasn't saying it to be dramatic. She was saying it because it was true. But she'd learned a long time ago that the truth had its own timing, and you didn't always have to rush it. Sometimes you just said the plain fact and let it do what it was going to do. "Before the Institute," Finch said. "Army, 3 years as a vehicle systems analyst, then 18 months with a defense contractor, then 6 months consulting on a DARPA mobility project." She paused. "That's actually where I ran into a version of this problem before. Different platform, different application, same failure mode. We fixed it with a reset protocol at the handoff." Finch looked at her. This is the part people always want to know about, what his face did in that moment. Whether he apologized, whether he acknowledged in some explicit way what the room now understood. That a problem he had spent 7 months on had been sitting in a blind spot he didn't know he had, and a 28-year-old woman with an orange-striped visitor badge had seen it in under an hour. He didn't apologize. Men like Warren Finch very rarely do the thing that would actually cost them something. What he did was turn back to the screen and say, "Curtis, let's model the frame flush protocol across the full disruption window. I want to see the latency curve." "On it," said Dr. Obi. Then that was it. Naomi didn't push. She didn't look around the room to collect reactions, didn't make a face, didn't do the thing where you wait for someone to say your name again so the room hears it associated with the solution. She pulled out her notepad, the kind with the pale blue lines that she'd had since her second tour, and she wrote down 3 things she wanted to follow up on before the end of the day. Priya, sitting 2 seats away, watched her write, and then looked down at her own notes and didn't say anything. The thing about that kind of moment, and I've seen it play out more times than I can count in rooms like this one, is that the people who understand what just happened usually don't say anything either. Not in the room. Not while it's happening. Because they know what the room is. They know who's in it. And they know that the safest thing, sometimes, is to let the record be the record and walk away clean. Dr. Obi confirmed the frame contamination at 11:14 a.m. The full validation, running the flush protocol against 47 disruption scenarios across the test environment, took 8 days. The results came back consistent. The Ellison corridor problem, as it had been called for 7 months, was closed. In the documentation that went to the director, the fix was attributed to a collaborative analysis effort by the Hargrove Institute mobility team. Naomi's name appeared fourth in the list of contributors. Finch's name appeared first. She found out when Priya forwarded her the document with a note that just said, "Saw this. Wanted you to know." Naomi read it. She forwarded it to her personal email. She closed the window and went back to work. This is not a story about fairness. I want to be clear about that. This is a story about what happened in room 114 on the 7th of November in a building where nobody looked up when she walked in. What happened is that a problem nobody could solve got solved. What happened is that 11 people in that room now know, even the ones who wrote the report, even the one whose name appeared first, exactly where the answer came from. There are things that don't make it into documentation. They make it into the way Theo Park introduced her at every subsequent meeting for the next year. This is Naomi Reeves. She's the one who cracked the Ellison problem. They make it into the look Dr. Harassen. Obi gave her the next time Finch was wrong about something. A look that said, go ahead without words, because he learned in one morning what kind of mind she had. They make it into the call Naomi eventually got from a program director at DARPA who said he'd heard her name from a source he wouldn't disclose and wanted to know if she was open to a conversation. She took the bus home that first night the same way she'd come in. She transferred at Union Station. She got off at her stop. She walked the 3 blocks to her apartment and stood in her kitchen and made tea and looked out the window at a parking lot and a liquor store and the overhead light of a laundromat that was always open, regardless of the hour. She wasn't thinking about Finch. She wasn't running through the conversation or imagining how it should have gone differently. She'd known women who did that, who carried the weight of every room that had dismissed them, who rehearsed the alternate version where they got the credit they were owed, and she understood why. She'd done it herself, early on. But somewhere along the way, she'd decided that the math was the thing. The problem was the thing. What you knew was the only thing nobody could revise or reclassify or move to fourth on a list. What you knew sat inside you, and it didn't go anywhere, and it was yours, and it did not require a room full of people to confirm it. The math had a witness. Her. That turned out to be enough. I keep thinking about that orange-striped badge. The visitor kind. The one that tells everyone in the building you're temporary, you're passing through, you haven't earned the right to a permanent one yet. Naomi Reeves walked into that room wearing hers like it was nothing. Because to her, it was nothing. A piece of plastic, a formality. It said nothing about what she carried in her head, and she knew that, and so she didn't need anyone else to know it yet. That's the thing I come back to. Every time I think about this story, there's a version of Naomi that doesn't walk into room 114 with that kind of stillness. A version that spent years being talked over, dismissed, redirected, and let it hollow her out. A version that sat at the back of that room and stayed quiet because staying quiet had become the path of least resistance. I've met people who took that path. The cost is real, and I don't judge it. But Naomi didn't take it, and I think the reason she didn't comes down to something she built long before she ever set foot in that building. She built her knowledge like she was going to need it in the dark, not to show anyone, not to win an argument, just because the problem was real, and understanding it fully was the only honest response to it. That's a kind of integrity that most people don't talk about when they talk about integrity. The private kind, the kind that has no audience, the kind that happens at a desk at 11 at night when no one is watching, and the easier choice would be to stop. Naomi didn't stop. She kept going because the work itself demanded it, and she respected the work enough to meet that demand. That's the first thing. The second is what she did with what she knew. She didn't perform it. She didn't announce it. When she saw the answer on that whiteboard, she didn't raise her hand like a student hoping to be called on. She just said the thing, clearly, because it was true. There's a kind of courage in that, especially in a room full of people with longer titles and more years and the quiet assumption that they had already thought of everything worth thinking of. She didn't argue. She didn't posture. She just said, it's the reference frame, and then she let the logic do the rest. That's the second thing. The third is what she did after. She didn't wait for Warren Finch to acknowledge what had happened. She didn't track her name through the documentation or make sure the credit was properly assigned before she moved on. She went home. She made tea. She looked out the window at a parking lot because she understood something that takes most people a long time to learn. If they learn it at all, what you know doesn't require external confirmation to be real. The answer existed before she said it out loud in that room. It would have existed if she'd never said it. The truth of a thing doesn't live in who gets credit for it. I think about how many Naomis there are, and how many rooms, sitting at the back with an orange-striped badge, carrying the answer to a problem nobody thought to ask them about. And I think about what it costs, not just them, but all of us, when those rooms don't make space for them to speak. The Ellison corridor problem got solved in 7 months plus one morning. The morning is what I remember.